The forest does not give you time to think. That is the first thing you notice. The trees press in from both sides of the track, close enough to touch from the column's edge, and what little light filters through the canopy in September arrives gray and flat and tells you nothing about what is ahead. Your boots are already wet. The track is not a road. It is a suggestion churned to black mud by the wagons in front of you, and every step costs more than it should. You are a soldier of the 18th Legion, and you have been marching for 6 days, and somewhere behind you in the column, there are 20,000 more men in the same mud, carrying the same weight, breathing the same cold air that tastes of pine resin in coming winter. You do not know that Arminius is watching. You do not know that he has been watching for 3 days, moving through the trees parallel to the column, counting the gaps between units, measuring the distance between the cavalry screen and the nearest wagon, noting exactly where the column thins and where the formation breaks down under the pressure of terrain and exhaustion. You do not know any of this because Arminius was trained by Rome. He served in Roman auxiliary units for years. He knows exactly what you are doing and why you are doing it, and he knows something you do not know, which is that you are not marching through Germanic territory. You are marching through a killing field designed around the specific vulnerabilities of the army you belong to. He did not design it last week. He has been designing it for 2 years, one observation at a time, each piece of Roman doctrine he learned in service, becoming one more crack he knew how to split open. Publius Quinctilius Varus rides near the front of the column. He has no particular reason for alarm. The province has been quiet. The autumn taxes have been paid. He is returning to winter quarters, which is routine, which is what you do at the end of the campaign season when the weather turns and the roads are still passable. He does not know there are no winter quarters prepared in this part of the forest. He does not know that the supply chain behind him has already been stretched to the edge of its capacity by the long march north, that the wagons carrying food and equipment for 20,000 men through the cold months are axle deep in mud and losing ground, that Arminius has already sent riders to 3 separate tribal groups with instructions on timing. The system keeping this army alive has a gap in it. Arminius found the gap years ago in Roman training camps, learning Roman doctrine from Roman officers, and he has been waiting for the right season to push through it. The battle that follows is one of the most analyzed military disasters in the history of Rome, and almost everything you have heard about it is wrong in the same direction. The common telling frames it as an ambush, Germanic warriors appearing suddenly from the trees, chaos, massacre, the end. That version is not false, but it is incomplete in a way that matters. The ambush was the mechanism of death. The cause was something colder and more fundamental. Throw out what your history teacher told you about Teutoburg. The legions did not die because Arminius was a military genius, although he was. They did not die because Germanic warriors were superior fighters, because they were not. They died because a system failed. Rome had no winter infrastructure on the Rhine frontier, no prepared winter quarters, no pre-positioned food stocks, no site selection protocol for establishing defensible camps in forested terrain in deteriorating weather. When Arminius hit the column on the 2nd day of rain, when the mud was deepest and the men most exhausted, and the wagons had become obstacles rather than assets, he was not defeating an army in the conventional sense. He was applying force to a structure that had already failed internally. 20,000 men died in 4 days. Legions 17, 18, and 19 ceased to exist. Varus fell on his sword. When the news reached Rome, the Senate's response was not grief in the way Romans usually grieve military losses. It was something colder and more systematic. Augustus walked through his palace repeating a phrase that became famous, "Give me back my legions." But what Augustus actually ordered was not a revenge campaign. It was an audit. The question was not who had failed. The question was what had failed and how to close the gap so it never failed again. This is the story nobody tells, not the battle, the audit, and everything that was built because of it. This is not a story about Roman glory or Roman conquest. This is the story of what Rome constructed after the worst military disaster of the Augustan age, the system that kept 5,000 men alive and functional through winter at the edge of the known world on a stone wall in northern Britain in conditions that no other army on earth could sustain. We are going to trace it layer by layer, from the surveyors sent days ahead of the column to read wind direction from hillside vegetation, to the brick columns under a headquarters floor that circulated heat through stone, to the ventilation holes cut into barracks walls after soldiers started dying in their sleep, from the grain stockpiled in October against the certainty of January blizzard, to the training conducted on frozen ground because the institution did not recognize weather as a reason to stop. And finally, to the morning a Roman general decided to cross a partially frozen river in darkness because the system was good enough to attempt the impossible, all the way to a piece of thin wood covered in ink pressed into the mud at Vindolanda for 2,000 years, in which a Roman soldier asked his family to send socks. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me what city and country you are watching from. I read every single one. And if you have not subscribed yet, hit subscribe. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The Senate investigation concluded sometime in 10 AD, and the conclusion was precisely as unsentimental as you would expect from an institution that thought in systems rather than individuals. The problem was not Varus's judgment, though his judgment was poor. The problem was not Germanic military capability. The problem was that Rome had been operating on the Rhine frontier with an assumption embedded so deeply in its military doctrine that no one had thought to examine it, that the campaign season ended in autumn, and armies did not need to function at full capacity in winter. Teutoburg happened because that assumption was structural. No winter quarters prepared in advance, no food prepositioned for sustained cold weather operations, no site selection protocol for the terrain. The supply chain could not sustain the column in the conditions it encountered, and Arminius had waited for the cold precisely because he understood the seasonal calendar of Roman military doctrine. He had served inside the institution. He knew its rhythms. He had used the gap in those rhythms to walk 20,000 men into their deaths. Tiberius took command of the Rhine in 10 AD. He did not move north. He did not pursue Arminius. He built. The first thing Tiberius did was something so procedurally unglamorous that most histories skip it entirely. He formalized the protocol for the agrimensors, the military surveyors who traveled ahead of the main column to select campsites. These men engineers, not combat soldiers in the conventional sense, were now given a checklist. Elevation to take advantage of natural wind protection and provide sightlines. Proximity to forests, because wood is the first requirement of winter survival, and a garrison that cannot fuel its own fires within a short haul begins to die around the 6th week of sustained cold. Proximity to a reliable water source, because 5,000 men need water daily, and a camp that has to melt snow for drinking loses efficiency quickly. Drainage, because a camp built on waterlogged ground will have dysentery by February. Natural defensibility, because a winter installation is not a structure to be abandoned. At dawn, it is a position that must be held through months of reduced garrison strength and limited mobility. Stand on the south bank of the Rhine in the winter of 11 AD and watch Tiberius watching his engineers work. The river runs gray and slow ice forming in the shallows, the current carrying plates of frozen surface east toward the sea. The air carries wet pine and cold mud, and the wood smoke from the survey team's fire 50 meters north, where the ground rises and the wind arrives from the southwest at a consistent angle. The agrimensors are pacing the perimeter of the proposed camp with measuring rods, their breath visible in the gray light, their boots crackling on the frozen upper crust of the ground. Tiberius watches in silence. He is not watching the ground. He is watching the process. He is watching whether the process is being followed. The first act of inhabitation at every new site is the fossa, the defensive ditch around the camp perimeter. 3,000 men in rotating shifts because digging frozen ground is an act of physical violence against the earth. Iron picks shattering against the frost layer's shoulders, burning from the percussion of impact, men working in near silence. Because the cold makes conversation expensive. The dirt that comes out of the ditch goes into the agar, the compacted earth rampart on the inner lip reinforced with sharpened timber stakes at the top. The agar is the first thermal intervention. A wall of compacted earth 2 meters high stops wind. It does not eliminate cold, but it shifts the calculation inside the camp from survival to sustainability. The difference between those two outcomes is the difference between an army that can fight in spring and an army that cannot. NATO's winter warfare site selection doctrine uses terrain masking ratings, wind exposure measurements, proximity to resource indices, and drainage assessments to evaluate proposed forward operating positions. The checklist is different. The physics is identical. The Romans arrived at the same conclusions because 20,000 men died when nobody used a checklist, and the institution encoded the lessons so deeply that it outlasted the civilization that learned it. Before we step inside the walls, these engineers built and look at what kept 5,000 men from freezing to death. We need to understand what kind of structure they were building, because it was not what you picture when you hear the word camp. The Castra Hiberna, the permanent winter quarters, was a city, not a metaphor for a city. A city with streets following a standard grid, a central administrative building, a hospital, a granary, communal baths, stables, workshops for smiths and carpenters, and cobblers and potters, and barracks blocks arranged in rows along internal streets. The total population of a major winter installation, soldiers, families, servants, traders, craftsmen, could reach 8 to 10,000 people. Some installations were occupied for decades without significant interruption. Castra Regina on the Danube operated as a military base from around 90 AD until late antiquity. Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain was occupied continuously for over 3 centuries. They did not disappear when Rome did. They became cities. They exist today. The urban street grid of Regensburg still follows lines that Roman agrimensores paced out in the 1st century AD, choosing a south-facing slope above the Danube for wind protection and resource access. The permanence of those structures is not accidental. It is the physical evidence of what Tiberius built after Teutoburg, a doctrine of construction so rigorous that the buildings outlasted the civilization that erected them. Inside the walls, the first thing any incoming garrison found was standardization so complete that a soldier transferring from Syria to Britain knew exactly where the hospital was without being told. A soldier who knows his environment does not freeze while searching for the latrine in the dark. A soldier who knows where the medical station is does not bleed out while disoriented by injury and cold. The layout was a weapon against confusion, and confusion in winter conditions is as lethal as any enemy. The barracks blocks were built around the smallest tactical unit in the Roman army, 8 men. 1 room, 1 brazier. The Romans did not have thermometers or heat transfer calculations. They had dead soldiers and surviving soldiers, and they counted which arrangements produced which outcome, and they adjusted the design accordingly. 8 adult male bodies in a sealed wooden room generate a reliable and measurable amount of heat. The contubernium was built around that output. Human bodies are furnaces. 8 furnaces in a sealed room maintain a temperature above the dangerous threshold, even when external temperature drops well below freezing. This was not accidental. It was designed in. He did not know Marcus Flavius Optio at Vindolanda in 122 AD, sleeping in that room with 7 men, that the dimensions of the room he slept in had been calculated around the thermal output of 8 human bodies. He did not know that the institution which designed his sleeping quarters had encoded that calculation so thoroughly that it would be rediscovered by U.S. Army Force protection engineers designing forward operating base accommodation standards in the 21st century. He knew that 8 men in a sealed room stayed warmer than 8 men in separate spaces. He knew because the men who had tried the alternative had not come back in spring. The walls of the barracks were thicker than structural necessity required. Archaeologically verifiable, the wall thickness at Vindolanda and Rhine frontier installations exceeds what is needed to support the roof load. The additional mass is thermal. Stone and timber hold heat. A thick wall resists temperature change, which means the interior temperature drops more slowly during the coldest hours before dawn, when the braziers burn low and the men sleep. The windows were small and positioned to face away from the prevailing wind. This required the agrimensors to know wind direction before construction began. Every barracks and every winter installation was built as a passive thermal system, and the system was designed by men who would never have called it that, but who understood from accumulated institutional memory that a soldier who woke cold woke impaired. The roofs were angled steep enough that snow would slide before accumulating to the weight that would compromise the structure and create channels for cold air to enter through stress fractures. The brazier burned through the night, and then the brazier nearly killed the men it was designed to protect. The carbon monoxide deaths emerged not as a single catastrophic event, but as a recurring pattern initially attributed to illness or individual weakness. Men fell asleep around sealed braziers and did not wake. Rome had no understanding of the chemistry of incomplete combustion, no concept of the colorless, odorless gas that accumulates in sealed spaces. What it had was the empirical observation that sealed rooms with braziers produced dead soldiers at a rate that rooms with ventilation did not. The solution was a hole, not a window, a small, specifically placed aperture in the upper wall or roof, positioned to create a convective current that drew air through the room and vented combustion gases without eliminating the thermal benefit of the sealed space. An engineering solution arrived at without the engineering theory to explain why it worked. It almost certainly saved more lives across 4 centuries of frontier winters than any tactical decision any Roman general ever made. The Principia and Praetorium headquarters and commandant's residence had hypocaust systems, brick columns each about 60 centimeters high supporting the floor above them in a grid, creating a void space beneath the floor surface. An external furnace fed hot air into this void. The heat moved through the space under the floor, up through channels in the walls, and out through vents near the roofline. The floor above was warm to the touch. The room above that floor was heated from below the physically optimal direction for space heating because warm air rises naturally and distributes evenly through the space it occupies. This technology was not invented for military use. It had been in use in Roman private homes and public baths for generations. What the building program after Teutoburg did was militarize it and code it as a standard feature of permanent frontier headquarters, treat it not as luxury infrastructure but as operational necessity. The commandant who slept warm made better decisions. The staff who worked in heated headquarters processed logistics more efficiently. The institution needed its highest value components to function at maximum capacity. Maximum capacity required a minimum temperature. The soldiers in the barracks had braziers and body heat. The disparity between their warmth and the commandant's heated floor was not an oversight. It was a design feature. We will return to what that disparity cost. If you are still watching, you are not here for the surface version of this story. You are here because you want to know how the institution actually worked, not the mythology, not the triumph narrative, but the specific mechanisms behind the outcome. That is exactly who this channel exists for. If you want to go deeper, if you want to help choose which buried chapters of history get pulled into the light, consider joining the Ancestral membership. Members shape the direction of this channel. They vote on topics, get access to extended research and early releases. If that is where you belong, the link is in the description. Because what we are about to get into the equipment that kept individual soldiers alive inside this system, and what it means that the soldier on the wall was still writing home, they asking for socks, changes the way you understand everything that came after. Marcus Flavius wakes before the others. This is not discipline in the romantic sense, not the warrior's instinct, not the officer's pride. It is a survival habit encoded over 11 years of winter postings. He wakes before the others because the brazier burns lowest in the hour before dawn, and the man who wakes last in a room that has lost its heat wakes into a cold that has already done its work on his joints and hands and capacity to think clearly. He is 37 years old and optio of the first cohort of the Tungrian auxiliaries at Vindolanda, and he has 7 men sleeping around him who are his operational responsibility, and his first act every morning is to confirm that all 7 are breathing. January 122 AD. The fort at Vindolanda sits on a ridge south of the wall in the landscape that soldiers posted here from warmer provinces called the end of the world. The wind comes from the northwest and it does not stop. The hills on the far side of the wall disappear into cloud for days at a time. The temperature inside the barracks at this hour is survivable. Outside, it is not survivable without preparation. Marcus dresses in a specific order. The order was not his idea. It was drilled into him at his first winter posting on the Rhine 2 decades ago by an optio who had learned it from a centurion who had served under a man who had served under Germanicus. The order is institutional memory made physical. The institution teaching itself to the bodies of its operators 1 generation at a time. He starts with the wool. 2 tunics, the inner one worn since yesterday against the skin. Wool retains heat when wet. This is the property that makes it the correct choice for the northern frontier, where dry is a temporary condition and wet is the default. Over the tunics goes the subarmalis, a padded garment of layered wool and soft leather stitched thick across the shoulders and chest and back, thinner at the arms, where mobility matters more than insulation. The subarmalis fits between his body and his lorica segmentata, the segmented iron plate armor that constitutes his primary protection against the things that want to kill him in the field. The iron lorica that protected Marcus from spears and swords was in winter his greatest physical threat. Iron at -8 degrees Celsius conducts cold directly through contact with skin. Fine motor control in the hands, the ability to grip a gladius, operate a ballista lever, write a duty roster begins to degrade within 40 minutes of sustained contact between bare skin and frozen metal. Within 2 hours, the degradation impairs combat effectiveness. The subarmalis is the engineering solution to the problem of a soldier's own armor functioning as a heat extraction device. Without it, the protection becomes the mechanism of incapacitation. He fits the lorica over the subarmalis. He wraps the focale, a length of heavy wool around his neck and throat, crossing it twice and tucking the ends under the chest piece. The focale protects the carotid arteries. This detail appears on every spiral panel of Trajan's column in Rome, the 155 carved military scenes that wrap around the monument like a documentary record of what Roman soldiers actually look like in the field. Every soldier in a winter scene has the focale. Sculptors did not invent decorative detail. They carved what they saw, and what they saw was every soldier in cold conditions wearing a wool scarf at the throat, because whoever designed the field uniform had understood empirically that the throat is where the body loses heat fastest when exposed. Marcus pulls on his caligae, not sandals in any sense. The word implies openness or vulnerability. The sole is thick leather, rigid, studded across the bottom, with iron hobnails set in a pattern that distributes weight and creates traction on ice. The hobnails bite into frozen ground and prevent the slipping fall that in winter conditions means a twisted ankle and 3 weeks out of operational readiness. Before lacing the caligae, Marcus wraps his feet in strips of wool. He does not know that a soldier named Masculus in the same fort sometime in the next few weeks will write a letter home asking for socks. He does not know that this letter will survive in the mud for 2,000 years and be read by people who will use it as evidence of everything the greatest military machine in the ancient world could not solve. He only knows that his feet are cold and that the wool helps and that the Caligay protocol was given to him by someone who learned it from someone who learned it from someone, and the chain goes back far enough that nobody in it remembers who started it. The institution remembered even when the individuals did not. Over everything goes the sagum, the heavy rectangular wool cloak that serves as weatherproofing on the march and as a blanket at night. In extended cold weather postings, soldiers at Vindolanda wore a larger, heavier version than the standard issue cloak. The Beerus Britannicus, a hooded wool cape produced in the northern British provinces, was traded across the entire military road network. Commercial records from the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD show it appearing in requisition documents from Gaul to the Danube. Officers sent them as gifts to colleagues in warmer postings. Soldiers who served a Rhine winter and transferred south kept theirs. In summer, a Roman soldier looked Roman. His equipment was Mediterranean in origin, optimized for the climate of Italy and the southern provinces. In winter on the Rhine or the Wall, he looked like the enemy. Closed leather boots, similar to Germanic and Celtic designs, have been excavated at Roman military sites across northern Europe. Issued as equipment or purchased privately by soldiers who understood that the local solution to the local problem outperformed the traditional Roman solution. The institution adopted them without ceremony or documentation. The boot that kept a Brigantian tribesman alive through a northern British winter kept a Roman soldier alive through a northern British winter. The origin was irrelevant. The warmth was the variable. The U.S. Army's Extended Cold Weather Clothing System, ECWCS, operates on a 3-layer principle: moisture-wicking base layer against the skin, insulating mid-layer for thermal retention, waterproof outer shell for wind and precipitation. The logic is identical to the Roman sequence wool tunic against skin subarmalis for insulation, sagum, and biros for weather protection. The physics of heat retention did not change between the 1st century AD and the 21st. What changed was the vocabulary and the materials. The Roman soldier dressing in Marcus's sequence every morning at Vindolanda was operating the same thermal management system as a modern infantryman in Arctic warfare training in Norway. Before we follow the supply wagons that kept Marcus and his 7 men fed through January and February, and into the long gray exhaustion of a northern British March drop, a comment telling me which part of this system surprised you most. And if you have not yet subscribed, do it now. You are watching Ancestral. The granary at Vindolanda smells of cold stone and grain dust, in the sharp animal smell of the mules that delivered the last load in late October. It is now January. No wagons have come from the south in 6 weeks. None are expected until the road condition improves, which the agrimensors who track these things have estimated will happen sometime in late February, assuming the current weather pattern does not persist beyond its seasonal average. This is not a crisis. This is the design condition. The granary floor is elevated on stone pillars, short squat columns of dressed stone that lift the floor surface 40 centimeters above the ground beneath. The pillars serve 2 purposes. They prevent moisture from migrating upward through the floor into the grain. Wet grain spoils, and spoiled grain in a frontier installation in February is a genuine emergency, and they prevent rodents from establishing access routes into the stored supplies without crossing open ground. The walls are thick. The interior temperature fluctuates less than the exterior because thermal mass resists temperature change. The grain stacked floor to ceiling in the storage bays will remain viable for months. The mathematics of feeding 5,000 men through winter were not left to seasonal improvisation. They were calculated in advance and encoded in doctrine. Vegetius, writing his military treatise De Re Militari in the late 4th century AD, described a provisioning principle he called Horeum, Provisio, granary provisioning, that was operational by the time of Tiberius. The winter stores must be full before winter begins, not during, before. The supply chain that functions in September does not function in January. The roads that carry grain wagons from provincial farms to frontier installations run through passes that fill with snow across rivers that freeze or flood through valleys impassable for weeks at a time. The army that waits for winter to arrive before stocking its granary is an army that begins to die in February. Rome did not feed its soldiers in winter. It pre-fed them in autumn. The granary was not a kitchen. It was a siege weapon pointed at the calendar. Every soldier in the Roman legions consumed approximately 850 grams of grain per day as his base ration. At a major installation like Vindolanda, with a garrison of around 1,000 men, plus camp followers' animals, and administrative staff, the daily grain consumption exceeded a metric ton. Over a 4-month winter before the spring resupply routes opened, the granary needed to contain enough grain to sustain the entire installation without a single external delivery. The Vindolanda granary, excavated by archaeologists in the 20th century, had that capacity. The winter diet differed from the summer diet in ways that reflected an empirical understanding of cold weather physiology. Cold increases caloric demand. Maintaining core body temperature in ambient conditions below freezing requires the body to generate significantly more heat, which requires significantly more fuel. The Romans understood this as an observation. Men who ate less in winter got sick faster, recovered slower, died at higher rates without possessing the metabolic framework to quantify why. The solution was practical. Winter rations were enriched with fat. Lard olive oil, aged sheep's cheese, and salt pork appeared in greater quantities in the winter supply manifests than in the summer records. Venison, hare, and fish supplemented the standard rations as documented in the Vindolanda tablets. One tablet records a request for additional cervines suggesting that hunting parties sent from the installation were not producing sufficient volume to meet demand. Smoked venison, dried lentils, hard biscuit, lard, aged sheep's cheese, salted fish, garum, salt pasca, the contents of a Vindolanda storage shelf told you exactly how far from Rome you were and exactly how long the garrison expected to survive without resupply. The standard daily drink of the Roman legionary was Pasca wine vinegar, diluted in water sour and thin, and entirely unpleasant by any modern standard of palatability. Wine vinegar is acidic enough to inhibit bacterial growth in water sources that would otherwise be dangerous for large groups of men sharing the same supply. In winter, Pasca was heated. A hot acidic drink at dawn before the work of the day began in freezing temperatures served a thermoregulatory function that the soldiers who drank it could feel without being able to articulate precisely why it helped. The word salary is a Roman word. It derives from salarium, the special allowance paid to Roman soldiers specifically for the purchase of salt. Salt was a strategic material of the first order in the winter economy of the frontier. Every cut of meat, every piece of fish, every food product that needed to survive more than a week without refrigeration was preserved with salt. A soldier who received his salarium and used it to buy salt at the market attached to his winter installation was, without knowing it, receiving a specific acknowledgement from the Roman state that his survival through winter was a function of a mineral compound whose supply chain the state was responsible for maintaining. Every paycheck in this modern world carries a trace of a Roman soldier eating smoked meat on the Rhine frontier. Garum, the fermented fish sauce that appears in nearly every context of Roman food history, was an ideal winter provision because it was functionally indestructible under storage conditions, and its protein density allowed small volumes to significantly enrich an otherwise monotonous grain-based diet. Honey-dried fruit nuts and legumes filled out the storage manifests. The Vindolanda supply records show a system of remarkable sophistication, not improvised provisioning, but a managed inventory with documented quantities, delivery schedules, and consumption tracking. The U.S. Army's pre-positioning strategy, formally codified in Field Manual 4-0 as the maintenance of forward-deployed war reserve material stocks at locations likely to be operationally relevant before supply lines can be established, is the Vegetian doctrine in modern regulatory language. The principle is identical stock, the position before you need the stocks. Because by the time you need them, the conditions that created the need will have also made resupply impossible. Vigesius described it first. The U.S. Army codified it 17 centuries later. The interval between them is filled with armies that skipped the lesson and left their dead in the snow. The training ground outside Vindolanda, in mid-January 122 AD, is a frozen rectangle scraped flat to the south of the fort's main gate. The grass has been dead for 2 months. The ground is iron hard, the frost sitting 3 inches deep in the soil, and 20 men are in formation on it, in the gray light of a winter morning, steam rising from their breath in the still air. Marcus Flavius walks the line of vine rod in his right hand, correcting a grip, repositioning a shield, saying the same things as Optio said to him 20 years ago on a frozen field on the Rhine. The cold does not pause the drill. The cold is the drill. The conventional assumption about Roman winter quarters is that they were a period of rest recovery, in waiting legions hibernating in their camps until spring made campaign possible again. This assumption is precisely wrong in every detail that matters. When the fighting stopped, the work intensified. Combat was in a specific sense the easier season. Armatura daily weapons drill was conducted regardless of weather, regardless of temperature. Centurions who commanded training on snow made an explicit argument. Physical discomfort during training creates the mental architecture that allows a soldier to function under physical discomfort in battle. The training was not incidental to winter. Winter was the point of the training. A man who had drilled for 4 months in frozen conditions and continued to function correctly was a man who would function correctly in the cold rain of an early spring campaign. Veterans instructed recruits. This transfer of knowledge, the tacit knowledge that survives only in lived experience, not in military manuals, was the other product of winter quarters that no logistics manifest could document. Vigesius could write down doctrine. He could not write down the moment when a veteran showed a recruit exactly how to angle a shield against a wind that had been driving sleet horizontally for 3 hours, or exactly how to maintain cohesion in a formation moving across ice-sheeted ground, or exactly where in a Germanic forest the mud would be deepest in early spring, and how to adjust march formation accordingly. That knowledge traveled from body to body, not from page to body, and winter quarters were where the transfer happened. The construction projects ran parallel to the training. Each legionary carried a shovel, an axe, and a pickaxe as part of standard kit, not accidentally, but because the institution was conceived from the beginning as capable of building its own infrastructure in any territory, in any condition. Roads were repaired and extended, their stone surfaces relaid. Where winter frost had heaved the paving, their drainage channels cleared. Bridges were built over rivers that had previously required boats or significant detours. Aqueducts were dug. The territory that Rome planned to control in the following year's campaign season was being physically prepared for that campaign during the winter that preceded it by the soldiers who would conduct it using skills that overlapped completely with their combat skills. The craftsmen inside the legion worked with renewed intensity. Smiths repairing armor damaged in the previous season's fighting, rebuilding the iron segmentation of the lorica, reforging bent helmet rims. Carpenters rebuilding shields from scratch where the wooden cores had cracked or the leather facing had failed. Cobblers replacing caligae worn past the point where the hobnails provided reliable traction. Bowyers and ballistari manufacturing bolt-thrower ammunition in quantity, stockpiling it for the spring. Every weapon, every piece of equipment, every element of the logistics infrastructure was inspected, repaired, and certified operational before the spring campaign season began. When spring came, Rome did not release a rested army. It released a fully rebuilt machine, retrained, re-equipped, restocked, and commanded by officers who had spent 4 months transferring knowledge downward through the hierarchy into the bodies of men who would need it in the field. The winter was not a pause in Roman military power. It was the mechanism by which that power was continuously renewed. Modern military doctrine calls this the readiness cycle, the deliberate alternation of operational deployment with training, maintenance, and logistics, sustainment designed to keep a force at peak effectiveness rather than degrading it through continuous use. The Romans did not call it anything. They just did it every winter at every installation on every frontier because the institution had encoded the practice so thoroughly that failing to conduct it would have been as unthinkable as failing to stock the granary. Before we go deeper into what all of this costs the men inside it, the deaths the institution produced despite working correctly, the hierarchy of warmth it enforced, and the price paid by the soldiers at the bottom of that hierarchy, the research foundation behind everything you are hearing today is documented in the book that sits at the foundation of this channel's work on Rome. It is dense and unrelenting, and it is worth it. The link is in the description. Open it while the story continues, because what comes next is the part the triumphal narratives always leave out. The Valetudinarium, the military hospital at a Rhine frontier installation in February, smells of wet wool and wood smoke and the specific sour sweetness of infected tissue. The Capsarius moves through the ward in gray morning light, doing what can be done, which is not always much. He has tools, he has training, he has in some installations a heated ward, the hypocaust extended to the hospital as recognition that a cold patient heals more slowly and dies at higher rates than a warm one. What he does not have is a solution to the fundamental biological reality of 5,000 men spending 4 months in a confined space in cold and dark. The carbon monoxide deaths had been the most instructive of the institution's early failures because they were the most systematic. Not individual soldiers making individual mistakes, but a pattern, men found dead around sealed braziers on the coldest mornings when the temptation to seal the ventilation points had overridden the procedural instruction to leave them open. The instruction existed because the pattern had been observed. The deaths continued at a reduced rate because humans in extreme cold make decisions weighted toward immediate warmth rather than abstract procedural compliance. The ventilation holes represented a design compromise between the ideal thermal outcome and the survivable thermal outcome calibrated to keep enough men alive to maintain the garrison's operational function. Frostbite presented a different kind of accounting problem. The Roman medical corpus Celsus Galen Dioscorides contains descriptions of cold injury consistent with what modern medicine identifies as frostbite, and the treatments described are limited to gradual rewarming and where tissue has progressed to necrosis amputation. A soldier who had not followed the equipment protocol, who had worn inadequate foot covering, who had allowed extremities to remain in prolonged contact with frozen metal, who had not wrapped his caligae correctly was a soldier who might survive the winter, but not with all his fingers. The institution protected the men who operated it correctly. It did not protect the men who deviated from its protocols, and it was not designed to. The cost of deviation was encoded into the expected outcomes. Winter dysentery moved through overcrowded installations with a logic that Rome could observe but not fully interrupt. Contaminated water sources under ice. Shared latrine facilities serving populations they were not designed to support at winter density. The Pascha regime reduced the incidence of waterborne illness without eliminating it. The valetudinarium in a bad winter held men dying of something no amount of thermal engineering could prevent. Desertion in winter quarters appears in Roman military records, including references in the Vindolanda tablets to soldiers listed as absent without leave during cold months. The institution kept soldiers warm enough to function. It did not keep them willing. Months of darkness, confinement, cold, reduced activity, and the specific psychological weight of distance from family and from the climate a man's body understood as correct. These produced a degradation in morale that the centurions and optiones managed through work rather than through treatment. More tasks, more structure, more routine. The institution that did not stop for weather also did not stop for grief. The legate slept above a hypocaust on a floor warm to the touch. The tribune had his own room and a brazier. The centurion shared quarters with one other man. The optio slept in a barracks room with 7 soldiers. The auxiliary at the perimeter watchtower slept in a leather tent. With a brazier, he was responsible for fueling himself on a platform exposed to the wind on 3 sides at the furthest point in the system, from the hypocaust under the headquarters floor. The institution did not allocate warmth equally. It allocated warmth according to the same hierarchy that governed every other resource within the Roman military rank: determined entitlement, and entitlement determined survival margin. This was not cruelty in any simple sense of the word. Optimization is the more accurate term. The institution allocated its most expensive resources to the components it could least afford to lose. A legate was more expensive to replace than an auxiliary. A centurion was more expensive to replace than an optio. The calculation was cold and accurate, and it worked in the sense that the institution remained operational through winter after winter across 4 centuries of frontier service. What it could not resolve was what the calculation cost the auxiliary on the watchtower. That cost was not entered in any ledger. It was not tracked the way the grain inventory was tracked or the equipment condition was documented. It was the invisible expenditure of the institution, the human material consumed in the process of keeping the system functional at the bottom of its hierarchy. He has approximately 3 weeks. Germanicus Caesar, standing on the south bank of the Rhine in the 2nd week of January, 15 AD, has looked at the river and made a calculation. The ice is not solid plates grinding against each other in the current, forming briefly, and breaking again in the black water. In 3 weeks, the seasonal temperature pattern will shift. The river will open completely. The advantage he is about to exploit will dissolve with the ice. 3 weeks to cross-strike and withdraw before the window closes. The tribes on the northern bank believe no army moves in January. They believe this because no army has moved in January on this frontier in living memory. They believe this because the belief is correct for every army except this one. Before we cross that river in darkness and watch the institution run at full capacity for the first time since Teutoburg, remember that the research behind everything you have heard today is on the shelf in the description. The book that documents the archaeology, the supply records, the medical sources, the military doctrine, dense, unrelenting, worth every page. Take it with you while the story finishes. Because what Germanicus does on this January morning is not a military triumph in the conventional sense. It is a proof of concept, and the proof changes everything. The river sounds different at night. In summer, the Rhine runs with a consistent voice water over stone current against bank. In January, it speaks in a lower register, a grinding percussive sound that carries across frozen ground and reaches the sentries on the south bank as something between a natural process and a threat. Ice plates the size of wagon beds collide in the current and shatter and reform downstream. The water between them is black and fast and cold enough to kill a man in 4 minutes if he goes in without preparation. Germanicus is 29 years old, and he is not going to wait for spring. He has spent 8 months on the Rhine studying what Tiberius built in the years following Teutoburg, absorbing the doctrine, inspecting the installations, reading the supply records, watching the agrimensors at their work. He understands something that most generals before him had not needed to understand. The infrastructure built after Teutoburg was not designed for summer. It was designed for this, for January, for the moment when the enemy's certainty about what a Roman army could and could not do became the most exploitable variable on the tactical map. The tribes along the northern bank, the Chauci, the Bructeri elements of the confederation that Arminius had assembled in 9 AD, had spent 6 years watching the Rhine in winter and watching nothing happen. The scouts posted to the northern bank during cold months were there as formality, a protocol maintained out of institutional habit rather than genuine expectation of threat. They were cold and bored, and they did not believe anything was coming. They were not wrong to believe this. They were wrong about this specific January. The pontoon bridge had been constructed upstream of the intended crossing point over the previous 48 hours in sections moved into position in darkness, assembled at the crossing site in the last hours before dawn. The engineers worked in silence by design. Sound carries across frozen water and frozen ground in ways that warm weather muffles. The institution had learned this too. The first units across are auxiliary infantry, lighter, faster, lower noise profile than the heavy legionaries. They establish the northern bridgehead while the bulk of the force waits on the south bank. The cavalry goes second, horses managed across the bridge by handlers who have worked with these specific animals in winter conditions for months and know exactly how much reluctance to expect. The heavy legionary cohorts go third in formation, iron hobnails on caligay, gripping the planking shields up the weight of each man and his equipment, transmitted through the bridge structure into the river below, where the ice plates grind and the current pushes east toward the sea. The institution crosses the Rhine in January. Nothing like this has happened on this frontier in living memory. In the villages and encampments of the tribal confederation on the northern bank, the first awareness of what is happening comes not as a scouting report, but as the specific sound of several thousand men in formation moving through frozen scrubland toward positions that were assumed to be safe because January made them safe. The response is confusion before it is resistance. Confusion is the tactical product Germanicus had calculated for. A force that does not know it is under attack in winter, does not have its winter equipment deployed, its supplies positioned for movement, its command structure assembled for rapid decision-making. It has its winter routines, its seasonal certainty, its fires against the cold. Arminius watches from somewhere in the forest interior. He had destroyed 3 legions in September because the system broke in cold and mud. He had used the seasonal weakness of Roman military doctrine as his primary tactical asset, timing his strike for the moment when the supply chain was overextended and the army had no prepared winter position to fall back to. It had worked with a totality that stunned Rome. 20,000 dead, 3 eagles lost. He does not in January of 15 AD have a response to what he's watching. The gap he exploited in 9 AD has been closed. The winter calendar that protected him, the assumption that armies stop moving in cold weather, no longer applies to this army. Rome had encoded the lesson of Teutoburg into its operating procedures at every level of the military hierarchy, and those procedures have produced legions that are standing on the northern bank of the Rhine. January, moving through territory Arminius had believed was permanently safe until March. The column reaches the Teutoburg region in late January. The trees press in from both sides of the track, the same trees, the same gray light, the same cold air, that taste of pine resin in coming winter. But the men walking through it now are not the men who walked through it in 980. They are the men the institution built after 980, equipped with the doctrine and the equipment and the logistics that the men of 17, 18, and 19 did not have. The bones are still there, bleached and scattered across the forest floor. Skulls nailed to the trees at the edges of the track, placed there by Arminius in the immediate aftermath of the battle as a message to any Roman force that might enter this forest subsequently. The rusted frames of Roman armor in the undergrowth, fragments of weapons, the specific detritus of an army that was ambushed and destroyed and left where it fell because there was no Roman force capable of returning to recover the dead until now. The silence in the column Tacitus records is complete. These are soldiers. They have seen dead men. What stops them is not the sight of bones. It is the calculation they are making as they walk through what happened here, comparing the evidence of the massacre against the institution they are now part of. They are walking through the proof of what the institution was built to prevent, and they understand it as soldiers understand things not as analysis but as recognition. Some of them had known veterans of Varus's legions. Some had family members who marched into this forest in September 9th AD and did not come back. The bones in the undergrowth were not abstractions. They were the specific dead that the institution had been built over and around and through, the reason for every piece of procedural knowledge that kept these living soldiers operational in January when the dead ones had died in September. Germanicus orders burial rites. The legions perform them with the formality the institution requires. Every soldier present understands what they are burying, not just the men of 17, 18, and 19. They are burying the version of Rome that existed before Teutoburg, the version that assumed winter was outside the operational calendar, that assumed the system would always have time to establish its infrastructure before the enemy struck. Step back from this specific January and look at what it means across the full scale of military history. What Germanicus demonstrated in 15 AD was not tactical genius, though he was a capable commander. It was institutional memory made operational. Rome had encoded the lessons of Teutoburg's site selection equipment, protocols, food pre-positioning, winter training, the construction of permanent winter installations that functioned as small cities into its operating procedures at every level of the military hierarchy. Those procedures had been applied consistently and without exception at every Rhine frontier installation for 5 years. And those procedures had produced legions that could walk across a partially frozen river in January and operate in conditions that had killed their predecessors, not because Rome had gotten lucky, but because the institution had learned the specific lesson that Teutoburg had taught and systematically closed the gap that lesson identified. Napoleon entered Russia in June of 1812 with the largest army assembled in European history. He did not pre-position winter supplies. He did not establish a castra hiberna doctrine for the Russian winterer. He assumed the campaign would be finished before the cold came, which is the various assumption restated 17 centuries later in French. The Grande Armée that entered Russia numbered approximately 600,000 men. The force that crossed back over the Niemen River in December numbered somewhere between 100 and 120,000. The cold killed more of them than the Russian army did. The Wehrmacht entered the Soviet Union in June of 1941. Operation Barbarossa was planned as a summer campaign to be concluded before the Russian winter. It was not concluded before the Russian winter. German soldiers outside Moscow in December 1941 were fighting in summer uniforms at minus 30 degrees because the Quartermaster Corps had not pre-positioned winter equipment because the campaign was supposed to be over. The institution had no winter mode. The Soviets, who had spent the previous winter at war with Finland, learning their own institutional lessons, were in felt boots and padded jackets. The gap in the German operational calendar was precisely the gap that Teutoburg had identified and Tiberius had closed. The Wehrmacht had not read Vegetius carefully enough. Every army that has ever tried to project power through winter has encountered this lesson. The ones who encoded it into their doctrine before the winter kept their armies operational. The ones who encountered it for the first time in the field left their dead in the snow. The camps the institution built outlasted the institution itself. Castra Regina on the Danube is Regensburg today, a city of 150,000 people whose medieval street grid still follows lines that Roman agrimensores paced out in the 1st century AD. Vindonissa on the Rhine is Windisch in Switzerland, inhabited continuously since the garrison first dug its fossa into the riverbank 2,000 years ago. Londinium grew from a logistical node in the military supply network into the city that would become the capital of Britain. The urban geography of Western Europe was shaped in ways still legible in the street maps of living cities by the decisions Roman surveyors made about wind exposure and river access and drainage when choosing sites for winter installations. The hypocaust technology spread from military infrastructure into civilian life across the empire. Private homes in the wealthier provinces were built over hypocaust systems in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Public baths throughout the Roman world used the same principle. The engineering solution developed to keep a frontier headquarters functional in winter became a domestic comfort technology that spread across 3 continents. The brick columns under the floor of a Roman villa in southern England, surviving 2,000 years in the soil, are the direct descendants of the brick columns under the floor of the military installations on the Rhine, where Tiberius first encoded the lesson after Teutoburg. The Vindolanda tablets are the final archive, thin sheets of wood the size of modern postcards written on with ink pens in the cursive Latin of the early 2nd century, pressed into the anaerobic mud of the fort's floor levels, and preserved there for 19 centuries until archaeologists began finding them in 1973. They are the most intimate surviving record of daily life in the Roman military. Not the triumphal inscriptions or the official histories or the military treatises, the actual correspondence of actual people living inside the institution at the edge of the known world. There are duty rosters listing soldiers by name and assignment, supply requisitions detailing quantities of grain and lard and pasca and firewood against documented consumption rates. A letter from the commandant's wife, Claudia Severa, to the wife of a neighboring installation's commandant, Sulpicia Lepidina, inviting her to a birthday party, the earliest known example of a woman's handwriting in Latin pressed into a piece of wood in the mud of Northumbria, surviving because the anaerobic conditions preserved what 2,000 years of time would otherwise have destroyed. There are complaints about road conditions, requests for additional beer, notes about the weather, the ordinary bureaucratic and personal record of thousands of people living their lives inside an institution at the edge of the known world, in a climate that was not theirs, maintaining a system they had not built and would not outlive. And there is the Socks letter. The soldier who wrote it, possibly Masculus, a name that appears in several Vindolanda documents, was writing to someone in a warmer province. The letter asks for underwear. It asks for socks. It asks for sandals more suited to the cold than what standard issue provided. He does not know, as he presses the ink into the thin wood, that this letter will be read 2,000 years later by people who will use it as evidence of everything the greatest military institution in the ancient world could and could not solve. He only knows that he is cold and that his family can help with that specific problem if they receive the letter in time. The institution that engineered the hypocaust and the aqueduct and the road network that connected 3 continents could not manufacture a sock adequate for a British winter. The man on the wall was writing the same letter home that soldiers have written from coal postings in every army in every century since. The institution was full of humans. That was always the thing that complicated the calculation. Marcus Flavius folds the requisition he has just completed and hands it to the duty runner. The document lists the grain inventory in the north storage bay, the firewood stocks against the projected consumption rate for the next 2 weeks, the equipment condition of each of the 43 men currently assigned to his section, and 2 requests for replacement collegae for soldiers whose hobnails have worn past the point of providing reliable traction on ice. Everything is in order. The institution is running. Across the fort in the barracks block on the eastern side of the Via Principalis, a soldier named Masculus is sitting with a thin piece of wood and an ink pen, and the particular quality of concentration that belongs to a man who does not write easily, but has things he needs to say. He is writing to someone who lives in a place where the temperature does not do what the temperature does here. He is asking for underwear. He asks for socks. He may be asking for something else news, a name the specific ordinary detail of a life being lived somewhere warmer, but the archaeology has not preserved that part. What the mud preserved was the material list, the evidence of a man who was cold and knew how to ask for help with that specific problem in the specific way that the institution's postal system allowed. The brazier in the Principia is burning. The hypocaust under the headquarters floor is circulating heat through the stone. The granary is 3/4 full against the pre-positioning calculation. The barracks ventilation holes are doing their work. 43 men in Marcus's section are accounted for and functional and equipped to the protocol standards the institution requires. Masculus folds his letter. He hands it to the duty runner. The runner takes both documents, the requisition and the letter, and carries them to the south gate where the courier is preparing to ride. The courier rides south. He will reach the first posting station in 2 hours, hand off the pouch, and return north. The pouch will move south through the relay system faster than any single rider could carry it toward the warmer provinces where someone is waiting for a letter that asks for socks. Outside the south gate of Vindaland is snow on the wall. The wall runs east and west from this point as far as anyone stationed here has ever walked in either direction. And on the north side of it, gray hills rise into gray ski, and the land beyond the hills is the place that Rome has decided is not Rome, the place that the institution exists to face and to hold at distance. The wind comes from the northwest. It does not stop. Marcus Flavius goes back inside. The brazier is still burning. If this is the kind of history you want more of the system beneath the story, the specific human cost of the institutions that shape the world we live in, hit subscribe and tap the like button so the algorithm keeps pushing real history to the people who want it. Share this video with someone who still thinks Rome was invincible because Rome was Roman. Tell them about Teutoburg. Tell them about Tiberius counting bodies and building a checklist. Tell them about the socks. And tell me in the comments which part of this system surprised you most. The engineering that kept the camps warm, the logistics doctrine that stocked the granary in October against a January blizzard, the hierarchy of warmth, the institution enforced from the legate's heated floor to the auxiliary's leather tent, or something smaller, a brick column under a floor, a hole in a wall, a thin piece of wood pressed into mud for 2,000 years, with a list of things a coal man needed from home. I read every comment. I will be here for the next one.